He knelt on the floor. He gathered scattered papers, one page at a time. Nobody offered to help. Victoria Hayes ran a $2 billion company. Her husband sat in the back corner.
You're
For
fired.
6 years, nobody asked
You're
his opinion,
divorced.
not once.
You're erased from my building.
You're fired, she said. You're divorced. You're erased from my building. She tore his contract in half. She threw a gold envelope at his chest. 12 executives watched, saying nothing. Somebody laughed first, prompting the whole table to follow. None of them knew the truth. That cheap plastic pen in his hand held a signature. It was the signature on the deed to their tower. Victoria never noticed already moving to her next slide. The tower kept her secret a little longer.
Wrong move. The arrogant CEO misjudges his quiet compliance completely. Let me tell you what happened.
Victoria Hayes tapped her stylus against the glass table, and the boardroom fell silent on command. 40 floors above the city, the morning sun cut through floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the mahogany surface into a mirror of gold. She stood at the head of the table in a cream Chanel suit, her dark hair pulled back with surgical precision, and she smiled at the room the way a queen smiles at subjects she has already conquered. "The Meridian acquisition numbers," she said, "are exactly where I want them." 12 executives nodded. David Vance nodded hardest of all, his tailored navy suit, a size too sharp for a man who did nothing but agree with her. He sat 2 seats down, close enough to touch her chair, far enough to pretend it meant nothing. In the back corner near the credenza nobody used. Marcus Hayes sat with a legal pad and a cheap plastic pen. He wore the same gray sweater he'd worn on Monday, the cuffs soft from washing the collar, slightly stretched. Nobody at the table introduced him as anything other than what the room had decided: he was the husband who filed notes. 41 years old, quiet hands, a face that gave nothing away. He clicked the pen once, twice, and wrote nothing down yet. Elena Rostova stood by the door with a tablet pressed to her chest. She was new enough to still flinch at silences like this one, and she watched Marcus the way people watch something fragile they expect to break. Victoria's eyes drifted toward the back corner. A small private smile touched her mouth, the kind she saved for moments she intended to enjoy. "Marcus," she said loud enough for every seat to hear, "since you're so diligent with your little notes, perhaps you can help us. What's the difference between accrued revenue and deferred revenue?" The question landed like a stone in still water. It was the kind of question you asked an intern. First week, first test. Not a man who had sat in this room silent and unbothered for 6 years of board meetings that never once needed his opinion. David Vance leaned back in his chair, already smiling at what was coming. Marcus set the pen down on his legal pad. He didn't look flustered. He didn't look at Victoria the way a husband looks at a wife who has just humiliated him in front of 12 strangers. He looked at her the way a teacher looks at a student who has asked a question they think is clever. "Accrued revenue is money earned but not yet billed," he said, his voice even unhurried. "Deferred revenue is money billed or received before the service is delivered. One is an asset waiting to be collected. The other is a liability waiting to be earned." He paused just long enough. "Given the language in the Meridian contract's Schedule C, I'd guess you're asking because the $12 million in row 14 is booked as accrued when it should be deferred. That would overstate this quarter's revenue by roughly 9%. Silence again, but a different kind, now thinner, sharper. Victoria's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes flickered fast enough that only Elena, watching from the door, seemed to catch it. David filled the gap before it could cost anyone anything. He laughed short and easy and turned it into a joke instead of a wound. "Look at that. Even the filing cabinet has opinions." The room laughed with him. Not because it was funny, because laughing with Victoria Hayes was the safest thing anyone in that room had ever done. Victoria laughed too, tipping her head back slightly, and the sound of it settled the room the way she wanted it settled. Dominance restored, order returned to its proper shape. "Thank you, Marcus." she said, already turning back to the screen behind her, already dismissing him from the conversation and from the century. That's why we keep you around. Marcus picked the pen back up. He clicked it once. Elena watched his hand instead of his face. She noticed the plastic pen was cheap, the kind sold in packs of 10. At a drugstore, chewed slightly at the cap, the way a man chews a pen when he's thinking and has nowhere else to put the thought. She felt something twist under her ribs that she didn't have a name for yet. Something between pity and unease, the sense of watching a man let himself be small on purpose. Nobody else in the room noticed the click. Nobody noticed that his thumb lingered on the barrel a half-second longer than a nervous habit required, or that a thin green light no larger than a grain of rice blinked once against his palm before going dark. The presentation continued. Victoria's voice filled the room again, confident, precise cutting through slide after slide of numbers that belonged in ways nobody at that table understood yet to someone else entirely. Marcus wrote 3 words on his legal pad, small, contained within the margin where no one glancing over his shoulder would think to look. Row 14, confirmed. He underlined it once and closed the pen against his palm, and outside the glass 40 floors below, the city kept moving indifferent to the quiet transaction that had just taken place at the back of the room, indifferent to the fact that the man everyone had just laughed at now held, in the space of one clicked pen, the first thread of the rope that would hang them. The office they'd given Marcus had no window, just a strip of fluorescent light and a door that didn't quite close all the way. Boxes of quarterly reports sat stacked against the wall, the kind of paperwork nobody's senior wanted to touch, which was exactly why it always ended up on his desk. He worked through the offshore account ledgers with a red pen, the twin of the plastic one from yesterday, cheap and chewed at the cap. Line after line, and the gaps kept surfacing the way rot surfaces once you know where to press. 3 shell accounts in the Caymans. A wire transfer routed through Luxembourg that looped back to an address 2 blocks from Victoria's penthouse. Numbers that didn't reconcile because they weren't supposed to. He circled a figure and wrote a small note in the margin and didn't look up when the door swung open without a knock. David Vance walked in first, followed by Richard Sterling, and neither of them bothered to close the door behind them. Richard was 71, silver-haired, the kind of wealth that had stopped needing to prove itself decades ago. He set a folder on Marcus's desk with the flat authority of a man dropping a verdict. "Sign it," David said. "Page 12, the addendum. We need it filed by noon." Marcus didn't reach for the folder. "I haven't finished reading the addendum." "You don't need to read it," Richard said. "You need to sign it." Near the filing cabinets, half hidden behind a stack of banker's boxes, Elena Rostova stood with a folder of her own pressed to her chest, pretending to search for something she wasn't looking for. She'd walked in 30 seconds before them, badly timed, and now she was stuck listening to something she understood immediately and completely that she wasn't supposed to hear. Marcus opened the folder anyway and turned to page 12 and read. "This addendum reclassifies 14 million in liabilities as deferred assets," he said. "That's not a rounding adjustment. That's a restated balance sheet." "It's a formatting decision," David said. "It's a federal filing," Marcus said. "The SEC has specific guidelines on revenue recognition, and this addendum violates 3 of them on page 1 alone." Richard's jaw tightened just slightly, the only crack in an otherwise smooth face. "Marcus, this isn't a request." Elena's knuckles went white around the folder she was holding. She thought about the rent due on the 4th of the month and the 2 years she'd spent clawing her way from the mailroom to this floor, and she said nothing because saying something had never once helped anyone in this building keep their job. Marcus set the folder down closed but unsigned and slid it back across the desk with 2 fingers. "I won't sign this." The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind that presses on a room before something breaks. "You understand what you're doing," David said, and his voice had lost its practiced ease, now gone flat and cold. "You understand who signs your paycheck." "I understand the numbers," Marcus said. "That's my job." David reached across the desk and snatched the folder up so fast the pages fluttered one sheet, drifting to the floor near Elena's feet. She looked at the top corner, visible a string of figures she recognized from a wire transfer she'd processed herself 2 weeks ago and had tried very hard since then not to think about. "Victoria will hear about this personally," David said, already turning for the door. "I imagine she will," Marcus said, and went back to his ledger as if the room had already emptied. Richard lingered a moment longer, studying Marcus with the particular contempt reserved for people who have stopped being useful. "You had a good thing here," he said. "Steady paycheck. A wife who could have thrown you out years ago and didn't." Marcus didn't look up. "Close the door on your way out." They left and the door swung shut, and this time it caught. Elena stood frozen by the filing cabinets for a long moment before she made herself walk past Marcus's desk toward the hallway, her heart going too fast for a woman who hadn't done anything except witness something. She glanced at him once, a small involuntary thing, and found him already looking at his ledger instead of at her, sparing her the discomfort of being seen seeing. "You should have just signed it," she said quietly. Not because she believed it, but because it was the only thing that made sense in a building like this one. "I know," Marcus said, and there was no bitterness in it, no fear, just a flat and terrible calm that unsettled her more than anger would have. That's the point. She didn't understand what he meant. She wouldn't not for weeks. She only knew that when she left the office, her hands were still shaking, and that somewhere down the hall, David Vance was already climbing the stairs toward Victoria's office with a folder in his hand and a story already forming on his tongue, a story where Marcus was insubordinate, unstable, a liability the company could no longer carry. Marcus sat alone under the fluorescent light for a long moment after they'd gone. He turned back to page 14 of the ledger, to the wire transfer that looped through Luxembourg and back to an address 2 blocks from his own front door, and he copied the account number onto a fresh page in his legal pad, small, contained, deliberate. Then he clicked the plastic pen once and set it down and waited for the door to open again, because he already knew, with the calm certainty of a man watching a trap close exactly where he'd built it, that it would. The summons came at 2 p.m., delivered by a junior assistant who wouldn't meet Marcus's eyes when she said his name. "Boardroom. Now." He capped his red pen and left the ledger open on his desk to a page he'd already memorized, and walked the long hallway toward the glass room at the end of the floor, past secretaries who stopped typing when he passed past the particular silence that follows a man already marked for something. The boardroom was full when he arrived, not the usual dozen. 2 security guards stood near the far wall, arms crossed, waiting. David Vance sat at Victoria's right hand, his tailored suit pressed sharp enough to cut. Richard Sterling occupied the head of the table's opposite end, arms folded, a man watching a verdict he'd already written. Elena stood near the doorway with her tablet, and she looked for one unguarded second like she wanted to be anywhere else on earth. Victoria stood at the head of the table, a single manila folder in front of her, and beside it a heavy golden envelope that caught the afternoon light. "Sit," she said. Marcus didn't sit. He stood where he was, hands loose at his sides, and waited. Victoria opened the folder. Insubordination, refusal of a direct executive order, erratic behavior inconsistent with fitness for continued employment. She read each line without looking up, the way a judge reads a sentence she has no intention of reconsidering. "The board has reviewed the incident from yesterday. We find you mentally unfit for your position." "I found an SEC violation," Marcus said. "That's what happened yesterday." "That's not what happened," David said. "What happened is you threatened this company's most important merger over a formatting technicality." $14 million isn't a formatting technicality. Victoria's hand came down on the folder, flat, final. "You're done, Marcus." She reached for his employment contract, a single stapled document sitting beside the folder, and tore it in half without ceremony, the sound of it thin and small in a room built for bigger noises. Then she picked up the golden envelope and held it for a moment, weighing it in her palm like something she'd been waiting all day to enjoy. "Divorce papers," she said. "Already filed, already signed on my end." She tossed it. It struck his chest and dropped, and the papers inside slid halfway out onto the polished floor, catching the light, spilling his name and hers across the mahogany for every executive in the room to read. "You're fired, you're divorced, and you're entirely erased from my building. Know your place." Nobody moved to help him gather anything. Marcus knelt. He knelt slowly, deliberately, and began collecting the papers off the floor, and the room watched him do it in a silence that had teeth in it. Somebody laughed first. It might have been David. It didn't matter who. The laughter spread the way laughter does in rooms that have been trained to follow one woman's mood. Quiet at first, then looser until half the table was smiling at a man on his knees on the floor of his own former office. Elena looked away. She pressed her back against the door frame and stared at the carpet instead because she couldn't watch it and couldn't leave either, and the not watching felt like its own kind of failure, the kind that would sit in her chest for a long time after this room emptied. Marcus gathered the last page. He didn't rush. His hands didn't shake. The cheap plastic pen had rolled beneath his chair, and he reached for it last, closing his fingers around it the way another man might close a fist. He stood. The security guards moved before Victoria said a word, one on each arm, gripping him with more force than the moment required. He didn't resist. He let them walk him toward the door, past David, who had risen now, and slid an arm around Victoria's waist, with the easy triumph of a man collecting a prize he'd been promised, past Richard, who didn't bother to look at him at all, past Elena, who still wasn't looking either. At the doorway, one guard reached for the badge clipped to his collar and pulled it free. The lanyard snapped. Marcus said nothing. They walked him the length of the executive floor, past the glass-walled offices, past the assistants who had stopped pretending not to watch, into the service elevator at the far end of the corridor. The doors slid shut. Through the shrinking gap, the last thing Marcus saw was Victoria already turning back toward the boardroom table, already reaching for her tablet, a woman returning to business because the interruption was over. The elevator dropped. Marcus stood alone in it, badge gone, contract torn, marriage legally ended somewhere in a stack of papers on a boardroom floor, and he turned the pen over once in his fingers, feeling the small, hard weight of it, the only thing they hadn't managed to take. Behind him on the executive floor, the glass doors to the stairwell clicked shut, with a sound too small for what it sealed, and Elena stood very still in the boardroom doorway, arms wrapped around her tablet, telling herself there had been nothing she could have done, not yet understanding that her silence in that room had just become the first quiet thread in a debt she would spend the next 48 hours trying to repay. Rain met him before the revolving door had finished spinning behind him, before he was fully clear of Sterling Hayes and its glass tower rising 40 stories at his back. He stood on the sidewalk with a cardboard box under one arm, holding what a man accumulates in 6 years of being ignored. A stapler, a framed photo turned face down, a coffee mug with a chip in the handle. In his other hand, the plastic pen. The suit he wore was cheap off the rack, the kind that soaked through fast. Water ran down his collar and he didn't flinch from it. Executives leaving through the lobby doors slowed as they passed him, umbrellas half raised, and murmured to each other in the particular tone reserved for a spectacle already retold twice by lunch. One of them, a junior VP, Marcus barely recognized, actually pointed, said something to his companion, and laughed the short laugh of a man relieved it wasn't him. Marcus didn't run for shelter. He crossed the plaza at an even-pace box tucked against his ribs, rain flattening his hair to his scalp, and he didn't hurry the way a humiliated man is supposed to hurry, doesn't look for a doorway to hide in, doesn't bow his head. He walked like a man with somewhere specific to be. The bench sat at the edge of a small park 2 blocks from the tower, half sheltered by a dying oak, its slats dark and slick with water. He set the box down at his feet. He sat. For a long moment he did nothing at all. Water dripped from his sleeve onto the pavement, and the city moved past him the way it moves past anyone. The sidewalk has already forgotten taxis and briefcases, and the particular indifference of a Tuesday afternoon. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a burner phone, a cheap black rectangle with a cracked corner, the kind sold for cash at a corner store. He set it on his knee and picked up the plastic pin and turned it over once in his fingers before twisting the barrel a quarter turn. It clicked softer this time, and the cap came free. Inside, where an ink cartridge should have been, sat a sliver of matte black plastic no larger than a fingernail, a drive small enough to have ridden unnoticed through 6 years of security checkpoints, board meetings, badge scanners that never once thought to search a man nobody bothered looking at. He fit it into the burner phone's port. The screen woke dark at first, then filled with a single line of white text against black. No logo, no company name, just a prompt waiting for a signature only he could give. He typed a string of characters from memory, 14 digits, no pauses, and pressed his thumb to the small sensor beside the screen. The phone hummed once against his palm. For a moment nothing happened, just rain on the bench and rain on the box and rain on the cheap fabric of his ruined suit, and then the screen changed and a name appeared that hadn't been spoken aloud in this city in longer than Marcus cared to count. A name filed away in registries in Zurich and Singapore and Delaware, a name that owned in ways none of the people who'd just watched him kneel on a boardroom floor would ever have guessed. The very tower he'd just been dragged out of. Apex Holdings, Master Access, Authenticated. A second line appeared beneath it, blinking. Stand by. Somewhere across the city in an office 40 floors above a different skyline, a phone lit up on a desk that had been waiting patiently for exactly this signal for longer than its owner would ever admit. Sarah Jenkins looked at the screen for exactly 1 second before she reached for her coat. Marcus didn't know that yet. Not the specifics, not the timing, only that the sequence had begun and could not be called back now, the way a stone thrown from a bridge cannot be called back once it leaves the hand. He closed the phone. He tucked it back into his coat dry pocket, careful hands, and picked the cardboard box back up off the wet pavement, and sat there a moment longer under the dying oak rain running down the back of his neck, feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere patient and cold between the two. Above him, the storm kept falling, entirely indifferent to the fact that 40 floors up inside the glass tower he'd just been thrown out of Victoria Hayes was already pouring champagne, already toasting a victory that had, in the space of one clicked pen on a rain-soaked bench, quietly stopped being hers to keep. Victoria's penthouse office looked better in the rain, she always thought, the water streaking the windows into soft gray ribbons while the city blurred beneath her safely far away. She stood at the bar cart in the corner working the cork from a bottle of champagne, with the ease of a woman who had done this before more than once in this exact room. To insubordination, David said, lounging in the chair across from her desk, tie-loosened jacket slung over the armrest. Best thing that ever happened to this quarter. The cork popped. She poured 2 glasses and carried them across the room, her heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet, and handed one to him before settling onto the arm of his chair instead of her own. To finally being rid of dead weight, she said, and touched her glass to his. They drank. Outside, the storm kept working at the glass, and neither of them looked at it. How did he look? David asked. On his knees. Smaller than I expected, Victoria said. And there was something in her voice that almost sounded like disappointment, as if she'd wanted more resistance from him, more of a fight worth winning. 6 years, and he just knelt there and picked up his little pen like it mattered more than anything else in the room. Pathetic, David said. Predictable, she corrected, and drank again. A knock interrupted them, 3 sharp raps, and Elena entered without waiting for permission, a tablet clutched to her chest, the way she'd been holding it all day, as if it were the only solid thing left in the building. Ms. Hayes, I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, But there's an alert on the Sterling Hayes master account, a large volume of financial data pulled from the boardroom terminal yesterday morning. It's flagged as unauthorized access, and there's a secondary flag on 3 of the offshore accounts of freeze request initiated. Elena? Victoria didn't turn around. Is this related to the Meridian merger? No, ma'am. It's separate. It looks like... Then it can wait. Victoria set her glass down and reached for the folder on her desk, the one stamped with the Apex Holdings letterhead. $700 million worth of a merger that would finally permanently secure her position at the top of a board that had spent 6 years pretending to respect her. The Apex acquisition closes in 48 hours. That is the only thing that matters this week. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am, but the alert specifically flags a 12-hour window before the freeze becomes irreversible, and if we don't respond... Elena... Victoria finally turned, and the look she gave her was flat patient, the particular patience of a woman who had never once had to explain herself twice. I said it can wait. Elena stood there a moment longer, tablet trembling faintly against her chest, the alert still glowing on the screen where nobody but her seemed willing to look at it. She thought about the wire transfer she'd processed weeks ago, the one that looped through Luxembourg, the one she'd tried not to think about since. She thought about Marcus kneeling on the boardroom floor. She thought about her rent. Yes, ma'am, she said, and left and closed the door behind her more quietly than she'd opened it. Richard Sterling called 20 minutes later, his voice crackling faintly over the speakerphone on Victoria's desk. The board wants confirmation the Meridian numbers will hold through the Apex signing, he said. No more surprises like yesterday. There won't be any, Victoria said. The problem's been removed. Good, Richard said. Handle the paperwork. I don't want Apex's people asking questions about internal turnover this close to signing. They won't ask, Victoria said. Apex barely responds to emails. Their CEO hasn't been photographed in a decade. We'll be in and out of that building with a signature before anyone up there even remembers our names. She ended the call and turned back to David, who had refilled both glasses without being asked. Outside, the rain had thickened into something heavier, drumming against the windows in a rhythm neither of them noticed. To Apex, David said, raising his glass again. To finally being untouchable, Victoria said, and drank and caught her own reflection in the dark glass behind her desk, rain-streaked and gold-lit, and for one unguarded moment entirely pleased with the woman looking back at her. She had no way of knowing, standing in that warm room with champagne going flat in her hand, that the 12-hour window Elena had tried to warn her about was already closing second by second on an account freeze that would not wait for a merger or a marriage, or a woman's patience, and no way of knowing that the man she had just discarded like a folder she no longer needed, owned in every legal sense that would soon matter very much indeed the very floor beneath her feet, the very building she was about to walk into, and the very silence she had just ordered Elena to keep.
Hold on. She fired and divorced him in the exact same breath while her lover laughed. If that were me, I would have burned that entire boardroom down on the spot. Imagine dedicating your life to a company and a marriage only to be thrown out into the rain like garbage. The sheer audacity.
The Apex Holdings Tower rose 90 stories above a plaza so quiet it felt staged glass and black steel catching the morning light, without a single logo visible anywhere on the exterior. Victoria stepped out of the car in a fitted gray suit, David, a half step behind her, both of them carrying the particular confidence of people who had never once been made to wait for anything that mattered. The lobby was marble empty and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. A single receptionist sat behind a desk with no nameplate, her expression pleasant and entirely unmoved by the folder Victoria set down in front of her. Victoria Hayes and David Vance Sterling. Hayes Corporate, Victoria said. We have a 10 o'clock with the CEO regarding the merger signing. Please have a seat, the receptionist said. Someone will be with you. Victoria didn't sit. I don't think you understand the size of what's closing today. $700 million. I'd like to speak with someone who can confirm the CEO is aware we're here. Someone will be with you, the receptionist said again in the same pleasant, unhelpful tone and returned to her screen. 40 minutes passed. Victoria's phone buzzed twice, 3 times, a cascade of notifications from the Sterling Hayes finance team that she silenced without reading, her jaw tightening with every minute the lobby clock ticked forward. David paced a slow circuit near the windows, checking his own phone, muttering something about incompetence and provincial building management. High above them, on the top floor, Sarah Jenkins watched a bank of monitors from behind a desk of brushed steel, one screen showing the lobby feed, another showing the account freeze ticking down its final hour, a third showing nothing at all except a cursor blinking beside a name. She was 52, silver-streaked hair pulled back, a woman who had spent 11 years as Apex's general counsel and had never once raised her voice to get what she wanted. They're getting anxious, she said to the empty room to the man seated behind her at the far end of it. Should I let them up? Marcus sat with his back to the window in a suit that had nothing in common with the one he'd been dragged out of Sterling Hayes wearing 2 days earlier, dark, precisely tailored, the kind of suit that didn't announce its cost because it didn't need to. His hands were folded on the desk in front of him, and beside them sat a single closed folder. Let them wait 10 more minutes, he said, then send them up. Sarah almost smiled. You're enjoying this. No, Marcus said, and there was nothing performative in it. No relish, just a flat and settled certainty. I'm finishing something. At exactly 10:50, the receptionist informed Victoria that the elevator was ready. The ride-up took 90 seconds, and neither of them spoke, both staring at the numbers climbing on the display, both feeling without naming it the particular unease of ascending towards something they didn't fully control. The doors opened onto a corridor of dark wood and low light, and Sarah Jenkins stood waiting at the far end of it, hands folded, expression unreadable. This way, she said, and led them past nameless doors toward a set of heavy oak double doors at the corridor's end. She opened them. The office beyond was vast floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, the city spread out below like something owned rather than merely viewed. A high-backed leather chair sat behind a mahogany desk turned away from the door facing the window. The CEO will see you now, Sarah said and stepped aside. Victoria walked in first, already composing her opening line, already rehearsing the tone she used on men who needed managing. Thank you for making time. I know your schedule. The chair swiveled. Marcus looked at her the way he'd looked at her across a boardroom table 1,000 times before. The same quiet patience, the same folded hands. Except now the room around him belonged to him in a way no room ever had before, and the suit fit him. The way power fits a man who has simply stopped hiding it. Victoria stopped walking. The folder in her hand slid from her fingers and hit the carpet without a sound loud enough to matter. David froze half a step behind her, his mouth opening on a word that never arrived. Marcus, Victoria said, and his name came out of her smaller than she'd ever heard her own voice sound, smaller than she'd known it could go. Sit down, Marcus said, and it wasn't cruel, wasn't triumphant, was simply an instruction, the kind a man gives when the outcome no longer requires his emotion. We have a great deal to discuss about your merger. Neither of them moved. Behind them, Sarah quietly closed the heavy oak doors, sealing the room, and somewhere in that soft click of the latch, Victoria understood in the pit of her stomach, in a place words hadn't reached yet, that the husband she'd thrown a golden envelope at 2 mornings ago had just closed the only door she'd ever thought was hers to walk through. Neither of them sat. Marcus didn't ask again. He simply waited, hands folded on the desk, while Sarah Jenkins crossed the room and took up a position at his right shoulder, a slim leather folio balanced against her forearm. Her expression, the flat, patient stillness of a woman who had waited 11 years for exactly this morning. This is insane, David said finally. his voice too loud for the room, the particular loudness of a man trying to fill a silence he didn't understand. "You can't just... This is an illegal stunt. Impersonating a CEO, ambushing a merger, signing whatever this is." "Sit down, David," Marcus said, not raising his voice at all, and something in the flatness of it did what shouting couldn't have. David sat badly into the chair across the desk, jacket, rumpled composure already fraying at the seams. Victoria remained standing a moment longer before her knees seemed to make the decision for her. Marcus slid a single printed ledger across the desk, unhurried the pages, squared with the precision of a man who had rehearsed nothing because he hadn't needed to. "Row 14, he said. 12 million booked as accrued revenue when it should have been deferred. I flagged it Monday morning. Nobody in that boardroom thought it mattered enough to check." Victoria stared at the page without touching it. "That's an internal accounting note. It proves nothing." "It proves you were told," Marcus said. "On record, in front of 11 witnesses 2 days before you fired the man who told you." Sarah opened the folio and set a second document beside the first, sliding it into place with 2 fingers. "The wire transfer through Luxembourg," she said, "routed to an account 2 blocks from your residence. Apex Holdings has held a controlling interest in the shell company, receiving those transfers since 2019. David's face had gone the color of the mahogany. "That's not possible. We vetted every offshore partner through Sterling Hayes' own compliance office," Marcus said, "which reports through 4 layers of holding structure to me." Victoria found her voice thin but sharpened at the edge, reaching for the only leverage she had left. "Marcus, can we speak privately? Just us. We were married for 11 years. You owe me." "I don't owe you anything," Marcus said, and it wasn't said with heat, wasn't said with anything at all, just a closed door where a door used to be. "You made that clear in the boardroom. I was listening." "This is extortion," David said, standing again, his voice cracking upward. "We'll fight this. We'll have our lawyers." "Your lawyers work for Sterling Hayes," Sarah said. "Sterling Hayes' line of credit was called this morning. Every retainer you've paid this quarter bounced at 9 a.m. David sat back down without seeming to decide to. Marcus folded his hands again, and for the first time since the doors had opened, something in his voice cooled further, settling into a register that had nothing left to prove. "You came here today to sign a $700 million acquisition. What neither of you understood is that Apex Holdings didn't just buy Sterling Hayes' debt. We've held it for 6 months quietly through 3 separate holding entities waiting for the signature that would make the acquisition irreversible." "What signature?" Victoria said, and her voice had gone very small. "Yours," Marcus said. "On the merger paperwork you were told to expect today. You already signed the preliminary authorization last week. Standard procedure, you said, before a formal closing." He turned a 3rd page around to face her own signature at the bottom of it dated 6 days earlier. "That authorization gave Apex Holdings the legal right to call the debt the moment the acquisition entered final review, which it did, this morning at 9:06. Victoria stared at her own handwriting like it belonged to someone she'd never met. "You've frozen our accounts," she said. "I've frozen nothing," Marcus said. "The terms did that themselves the moment you signed them. I only read the fine print." Something nobody in that boardroom ever thought I'd bother to do. David made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, the particular noise of a man watching the floor disappear beneath a life he'd assumed was permanent. "You planned this," he said. "The whole thing. The demotion, the paperwork, all of it." "No," Marcus said. "You did that yourselves. I only waited. Sarah closed the folio with a soft, final sound and stood there like a sentinel at Marcus's shoulder, watching 2 people who had spent 6 years, certain of their own untouchability, discover in the space of 9 minutes exactly how much of it had never been real. Victoria's hand found the edge of the desk, steadying herself against wood that she now understood had never once been Apex's to lend her a seat at. "What happens now?" she said, and it wasn't really a question. More the sound a person makes when they already suspect the answer, and are only asking to delay hearing it out loud. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, the same patient, unreadable look he'd worn through 6 years of boardrooms, through a torn contract, through a golden envelope thrown at his chest. Now he said, "We go back to Sterling Hayes, together, and you find out exactly how much of that building was never yours to begin with." The Sterling Hayes lobby had not changed in 2 days. The same marble, the same brushed steel elevators, the same security desk where a guard had once watched Marcus drag past it without lifting his eyes from a clipboard. This time the guard stood when the elevator doors opened, because this time Marcus walked in, flanked by 6 attorneys in dark suits, Sarah Jenkins a half step behind his shoulder. And something in the arrangement of bodies around him made even a man paid to be unbothered feel the need to straighten his tie. They rode up in silence. Victoria and David rode with them, boxed in on either side by lawyers who weren't theirs, saying nothing because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in a glass office 90 stories above the city an hour earlier. The boardroom doors were already open when they arrived. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the table, flanked by 3 board members Marcus recognized from 100 meetings where his opinion had never once been solicited. Richard's face upon seeing Marcus walk through the door in a suit that cost more than most executives' monthly salary arranged itself into the particular contempt of a man who hadn't yet been told the rules had changed. "Security," Richard said, not even raising his voice, the way a man calls for a servant. "Remove him." Nobody moved. "I said remove him." Richard repeated sharper, now glancing toward the door where the 2 guards who had once pinned Marcus's arms now stood very still, looking at each other instead of at Marcus, because word had already reached the ground floor of exactly whose name was now on the building's deed. "They work for me now, Richard," Marcus said, crossing the room at an unhurried pace, Sarah at his side, the attorneys spreading along the far wall like a wall of their own. "Everyone in this building does." As of 9:06 this morning. Elena stood near the credenza where she always stood, tablet clutched to her chest, and she watched Marcus walk past the head of the table without stopping to sit, watched the way the room's air seemed to rearrange itself around him, watched Richard Sterling's face lose color in real time. 2 days ago, she had watched this same man kneel on this same floor to gather scattered papers while the room laughed. She pressed her back against the wall and said nothing because she still hadn't found the words for what she was feeling, only that it sat somewhere between disbelief and something close to reverence. Marcus reached into his coat pocket and produced the plastic pen. He set it on the table, twisted the barrel a quarter turn, and drew out the small black drive that had ridden unnoticed through 6 years of security checkpoints. He crossed to the projector console at the side of the room, plugged it in and pressed a single key. The wall screen behind Richard's chair lit up. Rows of numbers filled it. Wire transfers, shell account routing dates stamped alongside names that half the room recognized from their own signatures. A ledger of 6 years compiled quietly, one clicked pen at a time in a back corner nobody had bothered to watch. "Row 14, Marcus said, which several of you were told about on record 2 days ago. He advanced the screen, followed by the Luxembourg accounts, followed by the wire transfers to an address 2 blocks from Victoria's residence, which several of you approved, without asking why an accounting reclassification required a personal delivery address at all. A board member near the far end of the table went very still. "You're bluffing," Richard said, but his voice had lost its floor. "I don't bluff," Marcus said. "I calculate. It's the only skill any of you ever credited me with, and it turns out to be the only one that mattered." The room began to fracture in real time. One board member turned to another voice, low and urgent, already distancing himself from decisions he'd rubber-stamped without reading. Another reached for his phone. A third simply stared at the screen, watching his own signature appear beside a transaction he'd clearly hoped no one would ever cross-reference. "This is a boardroom, not a courtroom," Richard said, though nobody was looking at him anymore. "It's about to be both," Marcus said. "The federal filing goes in this afternoon. Everyone whose name appears on that screen will have the opportunity to explain themselves to the SEC personally. Richard's composure, 40 years in the building, finally gave out entirely. He rounded on David, who was still standing near the door with the lawyers, and hissed something too quiet for the room to catch, and David hissed something back. And within seconds, the two men who had stood shoulder to shoulder over champagne were tearing at each other in low, furious whispers, each one trying to establish loudly enough for the room and quietly enough to avoid the recording Marcus had surely already made that the fraud had been the other man's idea. Victoria stood apart from all of it, silent, watching the screen scroll through 6 years of her own signatures. Elena watched her too, and for the first time in 2 days, something in her chest loosened enough to let her breathe normally, the particular relief of watching a system that had once flattened her finally begin of its own accumulated weight to flatten itself. Marcus withdrew the drive, capped the pen, and slid it back into his coat pocket, unhurried, as though the wreckage now spreading across the boardroom table were simply the last item on a list he'd finished checking off. The board members whose names appear on that screen have until end of day to submit resignation letters, he said. The ones who don't resign will be removed by the new ownership. Either way, this ends today. Nobody in the room laughed this time. By 4 o'clock, the boardroom had stopped pretending to be a place of business at all. 2 board members had already left with their phones pressed to their ears, voices low and clipped, calling attorneys of their own. A third sat with his head in his hands, staring at nothing. Outside, faint through the glass sirens threaded up through the streets below, distant still, but drawing closer, with the particular patience of things that know they will arrive eventually, regardless of speed. Marcus stood at the head of the table. He hadn't moved to sit in Victoria's old chair, the one she'd occupied 2 mornings ago when she'd thrown a golden envelope at his chest, but he stood in the exact spot where she had stood, hands a loose expression unreadable, the room's attention bending toward him the way it had once bent toward her. Victoria's composure finally broke. It didn't break loudly. It broke the way a dam breaks a hairline crack, widening all at once into something total, and she went down onto her knees in front of the table where 12 executives had once laughed at a kneeling man, her hands pressed together, her voice cracking on his name. "Marcus, please." She didn't seem to notice the mirror she'd become kneeling on the same floor in front of the same room. "I'll fire David. I'll do whatever you need."
Just don't let this touch my name publicly, please! I'm begging you!
David's head snapped toward her, betrayal blooming fast across his face. "You'll fire me." "Shut up, David," Victoria said, not even looking at him, her eyes fixed on Marcus with the particular desperation of a woman who has finally understood too late which floor she's standing on. Sarah Jenkins watched from her position at Marcus's shoulder, arms folded, her expression carved from something colder than disgust closer to the tired clarity of a woman who had seen this exact collapse before in other boardrooms from other people who had mistaken power for permanence. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Marcus looked down at Victoria for a long moment. He reached into his coat and produced the golden envelope. The room went very still. It was the same envelope, heavier now with new paperwork inside it, the paper stock unmistakable gold foil catching the afternoon light the same way it had the morning she'd thrown it at his chest. He held it out to her. Victoria stared at it without taking it, her hands still pressed together in front of her like a woman praying to something that had already stopped listening. "Take it," Marcus said. She took it. "Inside," he said, "you'll find your severance, 0. Your shares in Sterling Hayes liquidated as of this morning, transferred to Apex Holdings under the terms you signed. Your seat on this board vacated effective immediately." He paused. "And a federal referral already filed naming you and David Vance as the primary parties responsible for 6 years of falsified filings." Victoria's hand shook against the envelope. "You're fired," Marcus said. And there was no cruelty in it, no triumph, just the flat symmetry of a sentence handed back exactly as it had been given. "You're divorced. And you are entirely erased from this building. Know your place." Somewhere behind him, Elena made a small sound. Not quite a gasp. her hand rising to cover her mouth, watching the exact words land in reverse, watching a room that had once laughed at a man on his knees fall completely permanently silent around a woman in the same position. David lunged for the door, as if there were still somewhere in the building that belonged to him, and found two Apex security officers already standing there, unmoving, waiting on instructions Marcus had given an hour earlier. "You're fired as well," Marcus said, not turning to watch David freeze mid-stride. "Effective immediately. Federal agents are downstairs. They'll want to speak with you about the Luxembourg transfers before you leave the building." The sirens outside had stopped moving closer. They had arrived. Richard Sterling. The last board member, still standing near his old seat, set down his phone with the particular slowness of a man who understood that no call he made now would change anything, and said nothing at all because there was nothing left in the room that his voice could still command. Marcus turned from Victoria, kneeling with a golden envelope shaking in her hands, and looked instead toward the window where the city spread out below exactly as it had from the Apex Tower that morning, indifferent, unhurried, already moving on to whatever came next. "Sarah," he said, "let them in." Sarah crossed to the boardroom doors and opened them, and the sound of federal agents' footsteps in the corridor outside reached the room a moment later, steady and unhurried, the sound of an ending that had been written the moment a woman threw an envelope at a man she'd mistaken for nothing. Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of what had until yesterday been Richard Sterling's office, watching the plaza below through glass still faintly streaked with the morning's rain. Two black sedans idled at the curb. Police escorted Victoria and David across the marble forecourt in handcuffs, their names already circulating through the financial press by the time the elevator doors had closed behind them an hour earlier. Victoria didn't look up at the building on her way to the car. David did once and found nothing in the windows looking back at him worth the effort. Sarah Jenkins sat at the conference table behind him, a stack of folders squared in front of her, the final restructuring documents for Sterling Hayes' absorption into Apex Holdings. She'd been at it since noon, quiet, methodical, the same patient competence she'd carried through 11 years of waiting for a morning exactly like this one. "The board's resignation letters are in," she said. "All but two, and those two won't have a choice by Friday." "Good," Marcus said, still watching the plaza. A soft knock interrupted them, and Elena stepped into the doorway with a small cardboard box balanced against one hip, the same kind of box Marcus had carried out of this building 2 days earlier, and something about the symmetry of it made her hesitate on the threshold. "I wanted to come by before I left," she said. "I know Ms. Hayes' staff is being let go. I assumed that included her assistant." Marcus turned from the window. "Sit down, Elena." She didn't move at first, the box still braced against her hip, her eyes flicking between Marcus and Sarah with the same wary uncertainty she'd carried through 2 days of watching things she didn't understand happen to a man she'd pitied. Then she crossed the room and set the box down carefully on the edge of the table and sat. "You watched Victoria fire me," Marcus said, "and you said nothing. I understand why. I've thought about it, and I don't hold it against you." Elena's throat worked, and she looked down at her hands. "I should have said something, both times. I told myself I couldn't afford to lose the job, and I let that be enough of a reason." "You didn't participate," Marcus said. "You didn't laugh. You didn't sign anything. In a building like this one over 6 years, that makes you the only person who didn't." Sarah slid one of the folders across the table toward her, unhurried, the same way Marcus had once slid a ledger across a desk in a room 90 stories up. "Head of Internal Operations," Sarah said, "reporting directly to Apex Holdings Oversight Committee. The salary's on the second page." Elena stared at the folder without opening it the way Victoria had stared at her own signature that morning, except there was nothing frightening in what Elena was looking at. Only the particular disorientation of a woman who had spent 2 years learning to expect the smallest possible outcome from any room she stood in. "Why me?" she asked. "Because loyalty in this building has always been rewarded," Marcus said. "Just never to the right people. That changes today." Elena's hand found the folder at last, and she opened it and read the number on the second page twice before she trusted it enough to look back up. "Thank you," she said, and it came out smaller than she meant it to, thick with something she didn't try to hide. "Don't thank me yet," Marcus said. "The restructuring is going to be harder than the last 2 days. Half this building spent 6 years learning to survive by staying quiet. You're going to have to teach the rest of them a different way." "I can do that," Elena said, and for the first time since Marcus had known her standing in a doorway 2 days ago clutching a tablet to her chest, her voice didn't waver at all. Sarah gathered the remaining folders into a single stack and rose from the table. "The press conference is at 5. Apex's PR team has a statement ready on the acquisition. They're asking if you'll say anything about the fraud charges." "No comment," Marcus said. "Let the filings speak. They're more precise than I am." Sarah almost smiled at that and left the folders in a neat stack by the door on her way out, and Elena rose a moment later, box still on the table folder, now pressed to her chest in place of the tablet she'd carried through every hard conversation of the last 2 days. "Ms. Hayes used to say people like me were replaceable," she said, pausing at the door. "I don't think I believed her exactly, but I didn't disbelieve her either. Not until today." "Everyone in that boardroom believed something false about somebody," Marcus said. "Victoria believed I was harmless. Richard believed the board would protect him forever. David believed loyalty only ran one direction." He looked past her toward the window toward the plaza where the sedans had already pulled away, carrying 2 people toward a courtroom that would finish what a boardroom had started. "You're the only person in this building who never believed anything false about anyone. That's worth more than they ever gave you credit for." Elena nodded once and left, and Marcus stood alone at the window for a long moment, watching the last of the afternoon light flatten across the plaza, where 2 days ago he'd walked out into the rain with a cardboard box and a plastic pen, and nothing else the world thought he had a right to keep. He reached into his coat pocket and closed his hand around the pen. Still there, still cheap, the cap still chewed at the edge from 6 years of a patience nobody had ever bothered to notice. Below him, the city kept moving indifferent, as it had always been, already forgetting. The 2 people led away in handcuffs an hour earlier, already turning its attention toward whatever came next. And Marcus watching it from 90 stories up in a building that had once tried to erase him and now bore his name on every deed inside it, allowed himself for the first time in 2 days something close to stillness.
Fiction, but a husband's ultimate vengeance. I get chills watching arrogant elites lose their thrones. How would you have handled Victoria? Comment below, like, share, subscribe.